Thank you for joining today's webinar, Weaning, Planning for 2026. My name's Jodie Rosé-O'Brien and I'm one of the AWI Extension South Australia team. Thank you to everyone for submitting your questions when you registered. We'll pose those to Deb at the end of the webinar. AWI Extension South Australia's webinars are supported by Australian Wool Innovation, the South Australian Sheep Industry Fund, and the Department of Primary Industries and Regions. If you'd like to know more information about AWI Extension South Australia, you can go on our website, and I encourage you to follow us on socials, both Twitter or X and Facebook. Today's speaker needs no introduction. Probably well known to most of you, Deb Scammell is from Talking Livestock, and she works as a livestock consultant in the Clare Valley, where she assists producers with nutrition and production planning in their sheep and beef enterprises. She consults directly to farmers and runs industry courses and projects. Prior to starting her own business, Talking Livestock, Deb worked in the commercial nutrition space in several different roles, covering technical, sales and national management. Deb graduated from the University of Adelaide with a Bachelor of Ag Science with honours in Animal Science and has studied ruminant nutrition post-graduation. At this point, I'll hand over to Deb.
Thanks for the introduction, Jodie. The title today, Planning the Weaning Strategy, it's certainly looking different this year. So nice to see some grass. Once I started looking up sort of presentations of what I'd done in the past with weaning, I found a whole lot of early weaning and dry times presentations. So it's good to talk about weaning onto pasture this year and the implications that might come with that. But I'll go through some of the standard, reminders of, I guess, that weaning process, ewe recovery. So I guess why we still want to wean on time, even though there is grass. I'll talk about weaner feed requirements, some of the health implications which change a little bit with the different feed we're weaning onto this year, and also growth rate targets. And also imprinting. So, I think in a dry year we do imprinting really well, but it's still the importance of doing it when we've got grass around. So I'll cover all of those things off over the next sort of 40 minutes or so. And as Jodie said, happy to take questions at the end if something's unclear. So when we look at when to wean, I've been driving around paddocks today, plenty of grass, lambs are looking brilliant at foot. People that have already lambed, lamb marking rates overall are pretty reasonable. I think there is that temptation with grass and ewes in good condition to leave the lambs and wean them later, or potentially not wean them at all. So I'll go through some of the things we can consider, I guess, when we're looking at weaning time. So, the ruminant, obviously, those young lambs are a four-stomached animal, as you can see in the last diagram, with the rumen, amazum, reticulum, and abomasum. But what actually happens in that young animal, so through to a couple of weeks of age, is they've got this thing called the osophageal groove that you can see in that image on the left. So as they're suckling milk, the suckling reflex actually closes off the three other stomachs, so the rumen, amazum, and reticulum, and it diverts the milk through to the abomasum. So the young lambs actually start their life acting as a single-stomached animal similar to us, and then over time, that rumen starts to develop, as you can see in the images, until it's a full stomach that starts to absorb nutrients. And we've got the rumen wall and rumen microbes and things to consider. So, that's happening from about 2 weeks of age, and that whole process is starting to get complete around 3 to 4 weeks of age is when most of it's occurring. So that helps us work out, and I guess something we've touched on heavily over the dry seasons is early weaning, and how early we can wean is when that rumen sort of developed. But I guess just understanding that's the process that's occurring. And so when we look at energy that weaner, or young lamb prior to weaning is getting, as you can see at 2 weeks of age, they're actually getting all of their energy intake from milk from their mother. So their growth rates there are primarily determined by how well that ewe is lactating. So, a ewe on high quality pasture with some legume content or high quality supplementary feed is going to lactate well, lead to high milk production and good growth rates. But what we've got from that 2 weeks of age as a rumen starts to develop is that lamb will start nibbling on the pasture this year because it's available, and that energy will increase from the pasture and decrease from the milk. So you can see, and I've touched on this over and over again over the last few years, we were successfully weaning lambs at 6 to 8 weeks of age because their rumen is developed. They're getting, half of their nutrients from pasture and only half and under from milk at that point in time. And so it is possible to wean. I guess the advantage we have this year, we're not weaning based on ewe condition in most cases. And in most cases, we've also got plenty of feed in front of us. So, you can see with this graph, once we get down to that 14 weeks of age, we're around that 10% or less of the energy intake coming from milk and 90% from pasture. And so for me, that's sort of the point where I'm looking at, looking after the ewe and selecting the right pastures for the lambs. And even in a good season, it can be a good idea to wean around that age or prior. But I'll go through some of the reasons we're sort of carrying them through to there and what we can look at as far as weight targets in a good season, like what we're seeing. So, lambs I was looking at today, I think, without weighing conservatively, I reckon in a lot of cases we're going to be 5 to 10 kilos up on weight at that 12 to 14 weeks of age, just because of the great start lambs have had in most paddocks this year with just decent pasture, green feed early, and ewes have just come into lambing in slightly better condition. So that's going to make our weaner weight targets really easy. So you can see in this trial that was done in 2 sites in New South Wales, so Yass and the Central Tablelands, and there was also a site in South Australia, which is the black line there. We basically look at lighter weaners being much higher risk of mortality. And I guess when we look at body weight of young animals, the heavier animals basically are carrying, more fat cover and more energy to fall on if they're hit with sort of disease or if they go backwards post weaning. So that's why the heavier weaners, we have much lower risk of mortality or death sort of after the weaning process. So you can see there the South Australian trial line, that black line, the mortality was really high on the South Australian site due to worm burden. So you can see the trends the same, but 10% deaths on a 50 kilo weaner 50% of standard reference weight isn't what we'd expect. The green and orange lines, which were the New South Wales sites, is more in line with what we'd expect with merino weaners. So the scale at that bottom of that graph is the percent of standard reference weight. And because all ewes are a different mature weight, we actually look at weaner weight targets being a percent of the standard reference weight, which is the mature weight of that ewe. So standard reference weight is just a ewe in condition score 3, fully grown, so a middle-aged ewe with no wool on them. So I encourage you, if you haven't worked out your standard reference weight of your flock, to score, especially post-weaning, score the ewes, work out your average condition score. We can do an adjustment if they're over condition score 3, take off the fleece weight and work out what your standard reference weight is, because it does drive a lot of our sort of weight targets in our young animals through to joining also. And, for a standard South Australian merino, we probably do vary from 60 through to 75 kilos in those ewes in standard reference weight, and maternals could vary even more again. So I encourage you to do that. But the standard target for weaner weight to reduce mortality is that 45% of standard reference weight. And I'll go through what that actual weight is shortly for a 60 or 70 kilo ewe. But as I said, once they get heavier, we reduce that mortality risk. Over the last few dry years, I've weaned plenty of 20 kilo or less lambs, and we've avoided mortality by growing them quickly. But, this year, I think with pasture, we'll be aiming for that 45% of standard reference weight plus before we wean those lambs off. So, I guess I've had that question plenty of times over the last few weeks. It's green, the ewes are in good condition. Can we just leave the lambs on the ewes a bit longer? And, I guess my answer still is no. But depending a bit on your pastures available, worm burdens and things like that, which I'll touch on throughout the webinar. But I guess for me, it really is that ewe recovery. So I find in a good season, the temptation to leave lambs at foot longer can actually end up having an impact on your following year's conception. So allowing the ewes that recovery time after they've stopped lactating through to the next joining can help sort of with that egg development. And also, joining results are strongly driven by condition score and the chance to put fat back on their backs before the following year's joining. So I guess we're seeing ewes, I'm seeing a lot of lactating ewes that are well over condition score 3 this season, just because of the better conditions. But, for me, if we can get that ewe from 3 to 4 score and still give them that 17 weeks recovery time, the lifetime ewe data basically says we'll get an extra 20 lambs per 100 ewes at joining if we can increase one condition score. So even though they haven't dropped as much as tougher years, I'm still wanting them to give that time so we can get egg development occurring, get them up towards that sort of condition score 4, which sets us up really well for successful joining and lambing again next year. So, I guess I'm potentially not doing that early 10 to 12 weeks from the start of lambing that I've done with plenty of clients over the last few years, but I'm still trying to stick to a 14 weeks from the start of lambing lactation time, which is what you can see at the top, which gives us a full 17 weeks for those ewes to recover. You can see the bottom graph we've got there or figure, basically a 20-week lactation. If we just let them stay with their mums, we're reducing that recovery time down to 11 weeks, which potentially will have an impact on next year's joining. So, it does, as I said, depending on what pasture's available. But for me, the weaning process means I can select the better pastures for the lambs, which we'll touch on what that kind of means with green pastures. And, anything that's slightly lower quality, if the ewes are in good condition, it means we can utilise those pastures for our ewes. So for me, it's always about improving the growth rate of those young lambs, which is selecting the best pastures. So, a bit of a picture here, thanks ChatGPT. I love it for little images, but basically, I think leaving that lamb on the ewe for longer, what we find is we can start to see impacts of things like worms. So, you can see in that pasture, you've got your worm larvae. I guess the weaning process allows us to give that lamb a vaccination booster, but also check the egg count. Potentially over lambing pastures can get quite dirty. And what we find in the end, when they're only getting under 10% of their energy from milk, the mum does become a bit of a worm taxi. So, often you can have that lamb eating dirty pastures, picking up a worm burden, where for me, weaning, if we've got a bit of a worm burden to deal with, we can drench, put them on a clean pasture of high quality, and that's where we get those growth rates improving on those weaned lambs. So, yeah, I guess when I talk about weaning, I'm talking about it in quite a positive light. And so it does mean we need to wean well. And I don't have a blueprint for how I want you to wean, but for me, it's just realizing the stress implications of the weaning process and overcoming that as best as you can. And so for me, it's really about introducing those lambs to anything they're going to be exposed to later in life, prior to weaning with their mum. And, in some cases, yard weaning and things can work really well. But in other cases, if they've been on a similar pasture, keeping them on pasture can always also work well. So, I think different weaning systems can work for different producers depending on your setup. But it's just understanding the stress response and how we can overcome that so we don't have an impact on sort of post-weaning growth rates. So, when we look at the stress response, and we all saw it through the dry times, these lighter weaners, they're probably struggling a little bit for immunity anyway. But often you find even your healthy weaners, if they're stressed enough over weaning, what happens when they're stressed is their appetite basically goes down. Um, we then get decreased nutrient absorption. So, their rumen and things don't operate as well when they're kind of stressed. Often they'll start to urinate. You'll see them scouring, and they start to dehydrate, and that's where we see sort of an impact on immune suppression. So, I guess I'm going to talk a little bit about health of weaners later. But something to really remember is I probably see a lot of sort of health issues which come out of stressed weaners. And I guess a typical one is when we have heavy lambs, they're weaned onto a truck. They might be 38 kilos. They travel into the sale yards or they're sold on Auctions Plus and rock up somewhere. They end up in a yard, vaccinated, ready to go into a feedlot. By the time they've gone into that feedlot or gone back onto feed, it could be 2 or 3 days. They haven't adjusted from losing their mum yet. And a common scenario last year was just pneumonia then through the feedlots. And other sort of respiratory diseases, which often cause high mortality in those sort of lambs. So, for me, it's looking at that weaning process, adjusting them to feed, letting them settle down, letting them to adjust to that life stage, ideally before we're moving them and changing, something else as well. Thanks for the photo, Jody, on the left. I saw you had that in your title slide as well. So that's a great one of some of Jody's lambs at home getting used to the feeder incredibly quickly as lambs. But yeah, just lots of different situations, I guess, where we see neophobia. So neophobia is basically fear of the unknown. And weaned lambs are no different to little kids. Basically, if you've got a toddler and you show them how to cross the road and they get used to cars and they get used to the road and they get used to noise or kindy or whatever they're going into with their mother, they feel much more comfortable about going through that sort of process on their own. So it's exactly the same with your lamb. So especially you guys that are online that are breeding your own replacement, merino ewes or maternal ewes, it's just so critical that we introduce these ewe lambs as lambs to anything they're going to encounter later in life. So, the only thing the dry times have been positive in is that, I think producers, even in the high rainfall areas of the state, have worked out the advantage of getting ewes onto grain, getting them onto self feeders and things, because it was a necessity in the dry times. But I want you to remember to continue to do that even in the good times this year when we're weaning on grass. So if we can expose these lambs to the feed type and the method of feeding with their mother, they're much more likely to go straight onto it after weaning. And you can imagine when we talk about managing stress, if we can have them exposed to something they're really used to with their mother, they've got used to it, and then they see it post-weaning and it's not stressful at all. They just walk over and have a eat of that grain, or they go up to the self-feeder. But for me, if we have a decent year that goes for quite a while, and then we're trying to get these ewe lambs or wether lambs into a feedlot and we want them on a self feeder, it can just make that process so much better later. So if we're trail feeding in troughs later, trail feed them in troughs with their mums. If we're using self feeders later, put the self feeders out with their mums. And it only has to be, a week or two prior to weaning in a green year. So we're not doing it for nutrition, we're doing it for exposure. So you can see on the left, as I said, those lambs have just taken straight to that self feeder because they've seen their mums go up to it. The middle photo, it's green. There's great pasture everywhere. If older ewes have been trail fed grain, they'll often still come back to the trail because it's habit. And you can see there, they're training those young lambs. So that's going to make it much easier in a dry year to get those young lambs onto a trail again. And then the last picture, getting them used to loose lick drums. So loose lick drums, water troughs, anything they're going to go on post-weaning, I want them to be exposed with their mum. and that's going to just be so helpful down the track. And so this was an old project that was done in 2008. And basically, these lambs were fed 30 days before weaning with their mother, and they were fed in troughs, trail fed in troughs. And then this is the percentage of animals, basically. So this is post-weaning. The animals were fed these different methods. So the control ones had never been fed any grain at all. That black line there, the light grey line, they'd been fed on the ground grain, but hadn't been fed in troughs. And the darker grey third block, they were trail fed grain in troughs 30 days prior to weaning. So that's all with their mother. And you can see there, so that's day 1 of weaning. That's basically what percentage of animals were not eating the grain out of the trough. So they were fed in straight away after weaning, they were fed in the trough the grain. So you can see the control mob that had never been fed any grain. We had nearly 70% of them that didn't go for that grain in troughs at all. So only 30% of them did. The next one, so they'd been trail fed on the ground but not exposed to the actual trough. So we still had just under 30% that weren't eating. And the ones that had been pre-exposed a month prior to weaning in exactly the same setup, we only had just over the 10% that weren't eating out of the trough. So, the impact's probably not as bad when we've got these heavy weaners, so they're more than 45% of standard reference weight. But if you imagine a light weaner, you could see that control mob, it took close to 5 days before all of them were eating from the trough. And you can imagine on a light weaner, that lack of growth rate and them going backwards if there is no pasture can have a serious impact. So that's where exposure is just really critical to get the weaners. And you imagine the stress, it's taken them 5 days to adjust to that feeding setup, where the ones that have been exposed as a trough, already 85% of that mob have gone straight over with no stress and eaten because it's safe and their mother's shown them that it was the right thing to do. So just encouraging that even in this green year. So, when we talk about imprint feeding, there is also a benefit for rumen development. So another thing to remember in this green pasture year, I deal with a lot of feedlots that buy lambs from many different regions, and it's unbelievable how well those lambs did through feedlots in the last couple of years, because most lambs prior to weaning had some exposure to grain. We're pasture-fed lambs that have only had pasture their whole life and then go into a feedlot, at entry weight at low 40 kilos. It can be quite a process to get them onto grain, but they also don't always do as well on the grain because they haven't had it earlier in life. So it is a starch-based feed. So, barley, wheat, if you use it with caution, oats are still okay. They still have a reasonable starch level, or full feed pellets. So it's actually the starch that helps with the rumen development. And, my minimum is sort of 3 times of feed prior to weaning and 3 times afterwards. So, in a green year where you're not needing the grain, it doesn't need to be a huge effort. So it can be just putting that self-feeder out a week prior to weaning, or 3 trail feeds prior to weaning and then 3 trail feeds with the lambs afterwards. But that starch really does help rumen development thereafter, and often helps their performance, through feedlots and things, if that's what you're doing with them. So when we look at rumen development, this is a calf rumen that they'd studied. This is at Penn State University in the US. But the same thing happens with lambs. So you can see that rumen wall on the left. Basically, that lamb's only had exposure to just milk. So that's what the rumen wall looks like when it's on milk. So it's really smooth, doesn't have a very big surface area. The middle one, the lambs have had some exposure to hay, and then the one on the right, they've had that starch-based feed. So you can see as the rumen's developing sort of from that 3 weeks of age, with some exposure to starch-based grains, they're basically getting that raised papillae. So the rumen wall will have a much bigger surface area, and that improves the animal's feed conversion and their ability to kind of process grain later in life. So that's where, high rainfall areas, lambs through the drought, their performance later in life was a lot better because their rumen walls basically had just so much more of a surface area. So yeah, I guess I'm going to touch on some pastures and nutrition, but I guess just remembering post-weaning growth rate, I think realistically some of these lower figures with the quality of pastures I've seen over the last few weeks, we should really achieve much higher growth rates than this. But just remembering when we're looking at reducing mortality post-weaning, 50 grams per head per day is the absolute minimum we want any lambs growing post-weaning for the first 12 months of their life. So, I guess where I see ewe lamb replacements, maternal ewe replacements, often they are the ones that, we forget about probably more at the end of the growing season once pasture starts to dry out. Just remembering, I probably target more like 100 grams as a mob average, and we don't want the tail doing any less than that 50 grams per head per day. Because as you can see, those slow growing weaners have a massive high risk of mortality versus, at 100 grams, we're down well under that 5% mortality. So, going back to some of my targets, what we're looking at, as I said, if you calculate your standard reference weight, so, actually do those weights, because a lot of people estimate their standard reference weight. And even this week in a course, we actually weighed some of those ewes and they actually came up a lot different to what we'd been working on for the last couple of years. So I encourage you to actually weigh them rather than assuming you know where your standard reference weight is. But you can see their standard reference weight or adult mature weight of 60 kilos. Our birth weight target's often 8 to 9% of that, so 5 or 5.5 kilos depending on your mature weight. And then, when we look at weaning, as I said, we're looking at that 45% target of standard reference weight. So, if you're running a 60 kilo standard reference weight ewe, we want them to be over 27 kilos when we're weaning. And if you're running a bigger 70 kilo ewe, it's going to be that 31.5 kilos. So if you just do the 45% of your standard reference weight, and I encourage you just to write your weaning weight target down, and, if possible, actually weigh all your weaners at weaning so you know kind of where they're sitting. And as I said, I'm expecting them potentially to be a lot higher this year, just because most of the flocks I'm working with, the ewes are just lactating so well. So growth rates have been really good. And then, joining, realistically for a hogger, I'm targeting 90% of standard reference weight plus. But if you're joining ewe lambs, then we've got that fast growth pattern we're needing. If we're joining them at 7 months of age, my target then is sort of 80% of standard reference weight. So, between that 48 to 50 kilos can work really well if you're trying to get them ready for joining. But yeah, I encourage you to write down, weaning targets and then, some post-weaning targets or start collecting weights, because you then really follow that path of where, potentially nutritional pastures might be letting you down with some of those growth rate targets. So, when we look at nutrition, I'll touch on some of the pastures I've kind of been seeing, but I guess when we're looking at achieving weaner growth rates, it is that real balance between energy, protein, and fibre. So I guess when I walk out into the paddock, and I guess keeping in mind I'm working with a lot of cropping-based businesses that are also running sheep, we don't always get that perfect balance between energy, protein, and fibre. So even though we've got quite a large quantity of pastures in most areas, potentially we're needing to add in some energy in some cases on high protein pastures or, fibre in some cases with these real watery, lush pastures that the rumen's just needing that extra fibre to sort of slow the rate of passage through the rumen. And then, just touching on minerals. So, I guess for me, I always put this in probably every presentation in the triangle because I want you to tick the box on energy, protein, and fiber first, and then we start looking at sort of macro minerals underneath. So, I guess for me, the main macro minerals, especially for ewe replacements, calcium as they're growing, just so they get those calcium reserves set up on their bones to use as a future breeder themselves. But, also just to get, so we need 2 parts calcium to 1 part phosphorus. So depending on your mineral balance in your pastures or supplement, you potentially will need extra calcium. The other main one, I guess, is grazing cereals. They're very deficient in salt and magnesium, and it can have an impact on growth rate. So, post weaning on a grazing cereal, I'd be supplementing with magnesium, calcium, and salt in general. Micro minerals, I think really just looking at where your deficiencies are. So, probably with vitamins and micro minerals, I look at addressing deficiencies in the animal. So, you can do blood tests, you can do plant tissue tests, soil tests give you a little bit of an indicator. But yeah, generally just supplementing where we think we might have a deficiency that could be holding back our growth rate. So, I guess the heading of this and, acknowledgement to winning with weaners, which is a really good course, just to help you track sort of weaner growth rates. It's a half-day course. Jody can help you with it if you are interested in attending one. But yeah, I guess realistically, when we look at energy, protein, fiber, or minerals, it's always that limiting nutrient that limits production. So I guess this slide's potentially a bit more relevant in dry times. For example, we're feeding a weaned lamb that's 35 kilos only barley, and say it's only 10 or 11% protein. You can see down here under 10% crude protein, it's actually the protein that's limiting that growth rate of the lamb. But I guess I see the same things, a grazing cereal that could be really balanced for energy protein, but magnesium could be what's letting us down. So I guess with growth rates of weaners, it's always trying to identify what the limiting factor is, and overcoming that can often just considerably lift your growth rates per day. So you can see there the top yellow line, 150 grams per day. We've got that good balance between 13% protein and 12 energy. So that's a balanced sort of nutritional profile for that animal. If I'm looking at weather lambs, I'm obviously targeting a lot higher than that, especially post weaning. So, I guess just some examples I've seen over the last few weeks of what might be the limiting factors. So, on the left, just a medic pasture. So medic pastures have been unbelievable this year. Early germination, a lot, even in the pastoral country, we've just seen huge proportions of sort of medic across the ground. But a really highly digestible sort of feed. So, when we look at legume percent in a pasture, they're a lot more digestible at the same growth stage. So they give us a lot of energy, but there's also a lot of protein, and they also move very quickly through the animal. So we can be prone to things like kind of red gut. So yeah, I guess those 2 examples there on the right is lambs grazing lucerne. Both of those pastures can be 30% plus in protein. And often we're getting that 12 megajoules of energy per day, but the imbalance is really quite large. So we've got a lot of protein and they're actually burning sort of energy to help process that extra protein. So yeah, often on both of those feeds, adding a small amount of energy supplementation, and not a lot of people grow them anymore, but I actually really like putting oats out on feeds like that, just because sometimes I struggle to get them to take hay, but they will often consume sort of oats, especially if they've been exposed pre-weaning in a feeder. And it can help balance out that energy, protein, and fiber we need, and can actually improve the growth rate considerably by getting that balance right. On the left, that photo is probably a bit hard to see. That was in the Mallee today. that's actually an extremely tall medic pasture. So yeah, absolutely unbelievable bulk of feed there. But you can see there's actually still grasses in there. So, for me, that's a great balance. So I guess when we look at mixed pastures and pastures we're sowing for sheep, or weaner growth, if we can get around that 30% legume, 70% grass, we can actually get a really good balance between energy and protein. And depending on how mature the feed is, you can see there's a bit of dry residual feed in there. The fiber balance is actually pretty good in there as well. But as you can see with that one, that's well over that 30% legume. So we've potentially still got a lot more protein, and energy could be the limiting factor again. The other photo there is a little tricky to see, and I'm going to touch on this in a sec. With the early break we have had, we've potentially had a few issues with cereals almost getting too advanced now. So this is a lambing paddock, and the cereal's only at probably 5 leaf stage. It's actually been grazed quite short. For me, some of these paddocks where we've sown early March, and they're starting to run to head, we're actually losing a bit of quality when we look at weaner paddocks. So, I am looking at those shorter paddocks, shorter cereal paddocks for weaners, to maximise growth rate. And, I know on most places we just didn't have enough sheep this year to stay on top of that feed. So it has been a bit of an issue. So, back to this graph, to explain what we're looking at for those weaners. Basically, I'm looking, this season's just so interesting because, I'm seeing a lot of that early sown feed. It's actually already in that mid to late kind of flowering stage, and we're only in June. So, the season is a lot further through with some of that early grown feed. And you can see once you start to get into early to mid flowering, you're actually starting to lose quality. So on the left, we've got the digestibility percent of the pasture. So that's the portion the animal's actually utilising. So if we look at 80% digestibility of an early, a pasture that's just first started growing, often there's not enough of it. It's really highly digestible though, so they're getting a lot out of it. And you can see 80% digestibility on the right-hand side is giving us about 12 megajoules of energy per kilo dry matter. So really good quality feed. And the top of that line is the legumes, how they track over the year. And the bottom of the line is your grasses and annuals and things like that. So you can see, as I said, at every growth stage, they're always lower quality. But yeah, when we look at that line, between early and mid flowering, and what I'm seeing is some of these cereals are already down to sort of 8 to 9 megajoules of energy per kilo dry matter, where I want that, actively growing to late vegetation for our weaned lambs, that short feed. So I guess on a lot of farms, I'm not wanting to leave the lambs too long on the ewes because I want to put the ewes on that lower quality pasture, and I want to pick those better quality paddocks with the higher legume content, and that's where I want to put the lambs because, I think now we've actually got some green feed. We want to maximise our growth rates as much as possible on the feed while we've got it. So that means selecting the correct paddocks for those weaned lambs. So, I guess as a general rule, even if we're talking pasture, supplementary feed, anything, my main target, and it does depend a lot on the weaner, actual weight of the weaner. So the protein requirement will change. Your heavier weaners will need a lot less protein than your lighter weaners. But in general, a weaned lamb's going to need over that 15% protein. So, as you saw me describe, your high legume pastures are going to be well over that. Energy needs to be over 10 megajoules per kilo dry matter. If we're looking at those high legume pastures, I'm wanting energy to be, 12 megajoules plus at least. And NDF for rumen health, we want it around that 30%. So if you're not sure where your pasture's sitting, everyone gets used to feed testing hay and grain. You can actually just chop your pasture off in the paddock, throw it in the feed test bag, I use Feed Test in Victoria for mine. It's just over $60, and they'll actually give you a protein, energy, fiber, content, minerals if you want on your actual pasture. So if you're grazing similar pastures post weaning, or you're not sure quality wise where it sits, that's a really simple way to get those numbers, and you can work out whether you do have a limiting factor in your nutrition. So before I finish up, I'll just touch on health. So, I guess green pasture and a good year can give us some issues with things like worms. So, even further north, I was there earlier in the week. And, I think there's been a lot of good education about doing worm egg counts. And, we are seeing worm burdens even sort of north in some of the pastoral country, just because of that green feed. So when you look at worm burdens, like the worm larvae just love living on that green pasture. It's cool, it's damp, it's just ideal conditions for them now to survive realistically for months, until we get back to summer and some heat to kind of kill them off again. So, I guess general practice is to check worm egg counts, into pre-lambing, and give those, most people would give a ewe a drench into lambing. So, hopefully we've lambed onto relatively clean pastures. Lambs at foot should be relatively clean, but always encouraging you just to do a worm egg count on those weaned lambs or the mob prior to weaning, just so you get an idea of, how dirty the pasture is, but also whether we need to do that weaning drench. So I guess, as I said, that weaning process is a stressful time. So if we're carrying worm burdens and don't give them that drench to knock them down over that weaning process, anytime that lamb's under stress, their immunity goes down and the worm burdens are likely to elevate really quickly. So, if you're not used to having grass over weaning, or, over lambing as much as we have, I encourage you just to collect manure samples, and you can send them off to someone. A lot of the resellers have a service where they can do a worm egg count, or they'll know where to send them to. And yeah, just work out what sort of numbers of eggs per gram you're carrying, and then you can make some decisions. And, I guess on a clean paddock, sometimes I'm tempted to take ewes away and leave lambs there. But I'd never sort of do that practice without checking how clean a pasture is. And then even post weaning, encouraging you, best practice really is to just keep doing a worm egg count every 4 to 6 weeks to make sure we don't have an impact of worms on our post weaning growth rates. So vaccinations. So we haven't touched on yet, probably one of the biggest sort of risks, and I've already seen deaths associated with this year, is pulpy kidney kind of post weaning. So as I said, we're trying to select those better paddocks for the weaned lambs. Anytime we have a big increase in nutrition, we do have that risk of sort of pulpy kidney, and it is just quite a sudden death sort of post weaning. So with your vaccinations, best practice is to give your marking vaccination. And then, 4 weeks later, 4 to 6 weeks later, we can do it. We'd often just give that booster, and that'll give you that disease coverage for 12 months for all of the other diseases that are covered in the 3-in-1 or 6-in-1. But pulpy kidney is actually only covered for 3 months. So there's probably not enough awareness about that. So what you've got to think about is, if you've given your weaning booster and it covers you for pulpy kidney for 3 months, often I find, people will have them on a grazing cereal, say, and then we're 4 months post weaning and we've got this beautiful pivot of lucerne, and we decide to move them onto that. If they're outside that sort of 10 to 12 week window, you really need to give them another, minimum 3-in-1 to cover them for pulpy kidney, just to prevent those pulpy kidney associated deaths. And same if they're going into a feedlot and you're starting to put them on a grain ration, or any time you're sort of changing feed. But yeah, encouraging you to do that marking vaccination and the weaning booster, just so you've got that 12 months coverage and the 3 months post weaning coverage for pulpy kidney. And the other thing I'll touch on, I said earlier about that real stress. overweaning and ways to kind of manage that stress and the impact of stress on disease, but also just keeping in mind rumen health. So I guess what we often see, ewes and lambs will be on a pasture, and then all of a sudden the lambs are put on a totally different pasture post-weaning. You've just got to remember that rumen takes about 14 days to adjust to a new type of feed. So, if you've had them on some oats, say on a lush feed prior to weaning, keep them on the oats afterwards as they start to adjust to the new feed, or hay. And, there are some rumen additives that can help, yeast and things like probiotic type products that can help that rumen adjust better to that new feed. So yeah, I encourage you just to look at, not making too many changes, I guess, in management practice, feed types and things over that weaning period. But just as a summary before we go to question time, so I guess just looking at your weaning time, I know there's that temptation just to leave the lambs at foot now. Everything's fat, everything's looking great. But, I still want to keep in mind worm burdens and the best pastures we can possibly put the weaners on, and also recovery time for those ewes, so that we have a really strong result and decent condition score into next year's joining. I guess just planning. So, planning your health. So, prior to weaning, go out in the paddock. You can box ewes up in a paddock, do a worm egg count. So, I do plenty of them, sitting, watching them in the corner of the paddock for 5 minutes, jump out your car with your bags, collect the manure. You don't have to bring them into the yard for that. But we want that worm egg count done before weaning, so we could do a bit of a plan on worm management and how dirty the paddocks are. Plan your weaning method, whether you're going to yard wean, stick with paddocks. Look at the feed, ask for advice if you need to select the best paddocks, and then doing that imprint feeding. So you've had that week or two prior to weaning to do that introduction with their mothers. And, once we have weaned, monitoring those weight gains. So weighing them at weaning to see if you've hit that 45%, and then weighing them post-weaning. I love an OptiWeigh now because we can sort of daily just see how those weaners are performing. And that is really the best feedback to see how our pastures are performing as well. And as I said, just feeding for growth. So working out your limiting factors, whether it's minerals, whether it's protein, energy, or fiber. Sometimes it can be a real small addition of something which can have a huge impact on weaner growth rate, which realistically, while we've got this pasture, I want to utilise it to maximise growth rates as fast as possible, because we all know how much it costs to, finish lambs with grain, I guess. But yeah, thanks for your time and for jumping on board. I'll hand back to Jody for some questions.
We've got plenty of questions that were submitted prior to Rego, and we'll kick them off. Deb, some questions about weaning and post-weaning. First one is, what weight should a lamb be at for weaning?
Yeah, so I think we've covered that really well. So, work out your standard reference weight of your ewe, and then work out your 45%. And, there's plenty of webinars on early weaning if you want to watch back any of those. But, obviously in a tough year, we are going well under that 45% of standard reference weight. But in a general year, I want to target that.
Fab. Do lambs born in June, July need early weaning this year?
Yeah, so I don't have a crystal ball on pasture really. So, I guess there's indications been all along that it might stop raining, but yeah, until we see what the pasture is looking like later in the year. As I said, I'm not inclined to stretch out weaning. Like, I think we still need to look at that 12 to 14 weeks or earlier, working really well for ewes and lambs. But yeah, I think realistically, when we look at early weaning, I look at pasture quality, worm burdens, and ewe condition score. So that's going to be my triggers to look at all of those things before I make a decision on early weaning. So, when you get to that 8 weeks post lambing, for example, you can successfully wean a lamb like that with correct management. I'd be just looking at all of those things and making a decision from there.
Excellent. Perfect segue to the next one. With enough paddock tucker, is it bad to leave lambs on ewes longer? I think we sort of discussed that during the webinar, but yeah, just we want to recap on that topic, because I think there is a temptation.
Oh yeah, and I know there's markets that it's very easy to draft the lambs straight off the ewes, put them on the truck, and they're going over the hooks. And if that's your market, no problem at all. But I encourage you just to
Weaning weight.
monitor, when worms again,
Height weight.
make sure you're not actually checking them back, but also just looking at ewe condition score. So, often we do that to detriment of the ewes too the following year. So if the ewes are in score 4, the lambs are growing well, we're on clean pastures, not a huge problem. But if the ewes are starting to slip and it's 4 weeks till the lambs can go, I'd be tempted to wean them.
Excellent. Next one is, what extra should I do in preparation to mate? And I'm assuming this is April, May, drop ewe lambs at 7 months of age.
Yeah, so we haven't touched a lot on joining ewe lambs. So joining at 7 months of age is what I'd do with the ewe lambs. But as I sort of indicated, for me, it is that sort of, depending on standard reference weight, I'm targeting that 45 to 50 kilos as a, weight at joining, or 80% of standard reference weight. So it really is just making sure we can hit those growth rate targets. So, you are looking at that kind of 300 grams ish from birth right through. So yeah, really encouraging you to work out your weaning weight and then work out your target at 7 months' time. And if your pasture quality is not high enough, we're obviously having to add supplements and things to make sure we're really maximising growth rates if that's what we're doing.
Yep.
But yeah, I think, Jody, you've got resources on joining ewe lambs, I think, webinar.
Yes, there's
Yeah,
some
yeah.
information out there. Yep.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
so probably worth looking at that. Particular information on. There's a lot of information around about successfully joining those young ewe lambs.
Yep. Deb, there was a subsequent question that's come in through the Q&A on that mating ewe lambs. So is it
Yeah.
worth not mating the lighter ones that are less than that 80% of standard reference weight?
Yeah, so it depends on. I've probably got 2 lots of clients, so I've got a lot that'll join everything, but there is a lot of evidence if you're joining lighter. So we don't always hit 80% of standard reference weight at the start of joining, but generally we're getting them to grow through joining and then through pregnancy. But there's a lot of data around the ones you've joined that are much lighter, that don't grow as well through joining. They're less likely to wean their lamb. So for me, in a decent year where we're getting good growth rates on grass, I'd be more tempted to leave the whole lot together. But in the last few years where we've heavily supplemented animals to get them to ewe lamb joining weights or close to, I often draft off the bottom portion just because of the expense of feeding a large group of lambs versus the heavier 60%. So yeah, probably a bit of an individual discussion there. But yeah, really dependent on cost of getting them to those weights. But yeah, I think those really light ones, we're potentially disappointed because even if they do get into lamb, there's a lot of evidence that they have a much lower weaning weight than the heavier ones that you've joined heavier.
Thank you. Another question that's come through is, how many grams per head per day of grain for imprinting with you? So how much grain do we need to feed those lambs?
Yeah, so I often, obviously you're feeding them with the ewes. So, in a green year where they haven't had a lot of grain, I often just start at, 250 to 300 grams. That's going to go between the two. Obviously being a bit careful with starch introduction there too. But yeah, it doesn't have to be a lot of grain. It's just that they can all get to the feeder or trail and all of the lambs have a bit of a taste of it. So, often when I'm doing 3 feeds, it'll be 300 to 400 grams kind of max per feed. And then post weaning, it can only be, 150 grams of lamb's fine.
Yeah, thank you. Some questions that have come in about nutrition. What role do you see for rumen activators? And maybe before you answer the question, do you want to explain what a rumen activator is?
Yeah, so I think this person's rumen activator, I sort of mentioned it earlier about the rumen health. They're like probiotic type products. So, probably a lot sort of marketed into the feedlot business, but also over sort of weaning. And, I probably do use a reasonable amount in feedlot sort of rations of yeast and things. But there is good evidence that they sort of assist with rumen health. So for me, it probably goes back to what I said about trying not to make those sudden changes anyway. So For me, I'm trying to have weaners on quite similar feed prior to weaning and then post weaning. So, I'm probably not using them as much over that weaning period as what I would say when I put a lamb into a feedlot, because often a lamb will go from grass and then onto grain. And we're basically trying to change over that whole rumen microbe population. So I see a real benefit of yeast at that point. So yeah, it depends a little bit about whether we think there's a challenge to sort of rumen health, which, sometimes the stress of weaning even is enough to give them a challenge. And we do see a bit of a difference with things like yeast. Realistically, things like magnesium kind of help with stress. Probably that's probably more where I'd go to a nutritional supplement over weaning. And as I said, I'd use the yeast when you're introducing grain and things to lambs.
Excellent. And this more general question, what are the nutritional requirements for weaners of various live weights?
Yeah, so I think we've sort of touched on that, but and happy to kind of send some individual charts and things through if people want to email me. But generally once we're over that, 40 kilos, I'm looking at sort of 15% for protein. Where we're doing those early weanings with sort of 20 kilo lambs, it does go up to sort of 17% protein requirement. And as I said, then it's just balancing the energy, that the energy is balancing out with the protein. But there's really good charts, like the Winning with Weaners charts are quite good at giving you the requirements of protein and energy for various live weights. So you can download those online if you do a bit of a Google, or Jody or myself can send them to you. But yeah, I'd probably just look up resources like that if you're looking for individual information.
Yep. Happy to, if people contact me, to send them the link to the different Winning with Weaners tables that are available online. Question here, and I've had a subsequent question about this as well. Is vitamin A at weaning worthwhile? And the suggestion has come about giving an A, D, and E vaccination or a drench at weaning. So
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess the A, D, and E, goes back to sort of that triangle. Like if we've got I guess with microminerals and vitamins, if you've got a healthy ruminant system and no deficiencies, there's often no need to sort of supplement with those things. So, A and E are really critical in dry seasons. So, someone asked about vitamin A in particular. I sort of look at vitamins if animals haven't had grain feed for 2 to 3 months. There's a real need for vitamins. Where if, in a season like this where most of our lambs are grazing grass, hopefully prior and after weaning, I don't have such a reliance on vitamins. You're likely not to have a deficiency. So it really is just looking at the feed, paddocks for microminerals and things, and just determining if you're likely to have deficiencies. But I think through the dry times, I saw heaps of A&E deficiency, and I think we sort of forget that when we are on dry feed that we're potentially likely to have huge issues with vitamins. So it's just trying to remember that for the next dry run.
no worries. Next, some questions about animal health, and there's been a couple that's been submitted. What products are a waste of money if mistimed? It's a pretty generic question. I'm going to, unless the person messages me, I'm assuming they mean vaccination products, but happy for you to expand on that, Deb.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what they're alluding to, but yeah, I guess when we look at vaccination, keeping, doing everything in a timely fashion. So I guess the programs are designed on that pre-lambing dose that the lambs have got a bit of coverage. The marking dose is done so that lamb's got its own coverage. I probably have had a few sort of tetanus deaths and bits and pieces in marked lambs this year. So, I guess getting that coverage from the vaccination is relatively crucial at marking. Same as your AREVAC, if you're having arthritis issues, I'd be doing it then. And then, that weaning dose. But yeah, I guess pulpy kidney is a prime example of this. The number of calls I get 14 weeks after a vaccination, when lambs have been moved on to lush feed and they've had all these sudden deaths. So, I think remembering that 3-month limit on pulpy kidney is just critical because, then people bring them in, vaccinate the rest, but, you've lost that couple of percent of lambs that are often the big ones that have scoffed that lush feed and you've lost them to pulpy, which is really preventable.
Great, Deb. Some another question that's come in that's relating to imprinting. How much time before weaning would you start feeding for imprinting? I think we sort of discussed that, but would you just like to
Yeah, and I think it does depend on how trained your older ewes are. So in my perfect breeding scenario, like all your mature ewes are trained onto feeders or trail. So if it's a week off weaning in this sort of lush year when you're not actually needing grain for nutrition, as soon as you drive out the trail feeding cart, the old ewes will just run, which any over the last couple of years that have been fed will. And those lambs are going to be trained from day one. But if your old ewes haven't been fed on that feeding system, you're going to have to start a couple of weeks at least before weaning. So, yeah, I guess with trained breeding ewes in a lush year, I'm only putting out feeders and trail feeds, a week or two at the most prior to weaning because I know the lambs are going to be trained immediately. So it depends a bit on your individual setup.
Another one question here about copper. Is that more important in wet years compared to dry years?
Yeah, so I mean, it is again just looking at the mineral content, and if you're using like if you're grazing a sort of monoculture pasture and very similar species and soil types, it can be worthwhile doing like plant tissue tests, which you can do through our APAL in Adelaide. But often when the feed is very watery, it's got very low mineral concentration. So, with a bit of dry feed or a sort of different, some perennial pastures or some bush or some other bits, we can often have a more balanced pasture. But if you're grazing a monoculture of, say, cereals on copper deficient soil and it's very watery, you are likely to need some additional copper. But yeah, probably encouraging you to test for that first, and then you can actually work out what your shortfall is, especially if you're grazing a single species.
Um, Another question here is, will rickets be an issue if you have high early growth potential in your lambs, and particularly if that's getting fulfilled with the good feed we have this year? And any suggestions how to prevent it?
Yeah, so I guess it's that's a deficiency disease again. So yeah, if you're likely to have deficiencies that are causing any nutritional issues, as I said, the watery feed's going to be more of a problem. And then overcoming all those nutritional deficiencies with supplements is going to be the only way you're basically going to avoid those sort of health problems. So yeah, it's that's often vitamin D, or it can be phosphorus or calcium, which affects bones. But yeah, I guess if you've heard me talk before, all I ever talk about is calcium and magnesium supplementation. So I guess another reason, I think we've had a really good result over lambing. We've probably backed off minerals a bit, ewes have themselves. But post weaning on watery feed, I still want those high calcium, high magnesium, and vitamin type supplements out there.
Yep. Another question, do you have a preference for a maximum mob size of weaned lambs?
Not probably precisely. So, and I didn't really touch on it with pastures. But realistically, I'm often just matching up paddock sizes. And especially what I said about the cereals, probably getting a bit of ahead of us this year. Just working on a DSE per hectare and trying to get that sort of grazing pressure right to keep the pastures where we need them to be. But I guess in general, I've successfully weaned, 800 to 1,000 lambs where we need to heavily stock a paddock. But I find social structure, I probably prefer sort of maxing out at that 500 to 600 wean lambs. But as I said, I work with a lot of croppers that we don't always have optimum paddock size for the lambs. So then it becomes a bit of a juggle between grazing pressure and not going too big on mob sizes.
Yep. And a perfect segue, the next question is, would you put what number of adult ewes with the wean lambs? This person suggested 10, but I guess it's going to depend on the mob size. Would you recommend that?
Yeah, so yeah, I've got no problem with putting adult ewes in with wean lambs. So, if the lambs have calmed down in a yard, they're used to the pasture, they know where the water troughs and things are, I often wouldn't worry about putting the adult ewes in. But, in situations where there's a dam or a trough they're not used to and you haven't been able to pre-expose them or they're particularly flighty, sometimes I'd even cross wean. But you've just got to be careful with things like worm burden. So, if you're weaning everything onto a clean paddock, just make sure obviously those 10 adult ewes are drenched as well. But often it is just a small number of ewes that can help calm down a mob of recently weaned lambs.
Thank you. And this will be our final question, unless someone gets in quick. Saw a photo today of some aphids in pastures. Do you want to touch on the impact of aphids?
Yeah, so aphids have been a bit of an issue this year. So, there's wheat aphids that have had a fair impact on some of the cereals I've been looking at. So the hard thing is where you sow feed, potentially you're not looking at it as much as you might be with your crops. And they can just have a huge impact on growth rate of some of those cereals. So, I had a good look around some yesterday and the plants were incredibly stressed. They'd gone purple. Growth rates were, probably quarter of what they should have been, and they were so far behind the other paddocks that weren't affected. So it is worth getting your agronomist to have a look at your cropped like for feed paddocks as well, and just spray those out if need be. There's also another aphid called cowpea aphid that'll be on vetch and lucerne and things, and that can actually cause photosensitization. So you'll get the scaly ears and the nose, and you can get deaths associated with that. So yeah, I feel like every year that kind of pops up when we're unaware. There's already cowpea aphid around. So yeah, just making sure you look at your legume-based pastures and check for that before you put recently weaned lambs onto it.
Yep, great advice there, Deb. And there's a webinar that we ran, that AWI Extension ran a few years ago on aphids. Jump on our YouTube channel and you'll be able to find that. So if you want to get some more information on that, we had a quite a bad run there a few years ago. That's probably more than I can remember. But yeah, no, thank you so much. I want to thank everyone for joining today's webinar. Deb, thank you so much for sharing your insights and expertise in our annual weaning webinar. As I said, if you've got any other questions, please contact me using the information provided in your webinar registration. I thank you for your time and have a wonderful evening.